In this video, I'll tell you about how and why I choose the colors that I choose for the bases to my miniatures. Still no haircut, still straight pheasant. A caveat here, I'm going to be talking predominantly about painting techniques for tabletop miniatures. If you are painting a model for display, then you generally are going to spend a lot of time on that one base. You're going to make sure that it matches up in a certain way to the way the model works. You're going to bounce off the colors of the model, and you're going to figure out harmonies and complementary colors, and there's a whole lot that goes into display painting. What I'm talking about here is going to be painting the bases on the models that you actually game on the tabletop with. Just take that into consideration. I see a lot of miniature paint jobs out there on the internet, and many of them don't have a painted base. I've finished painting the entire model, and now I'm going to show it off on whatever internet forum, communication, whatever that you prefer. And a lot of times it's like, yeah, but what your base isn't done. Like, there's just a bunch of weird paint smudges that, when you were painting, you got it on the base. Like, and they're like, oh yeah, no, I'm gonna do that later on. And a lot of people suffer from that issue because I personally think, I think they're looking at bases the wrong way. A lot of people hate basing. Some people love basing, but some people love, radishes. I'm not a big radish fan myself. So, different strokes, different folks. But the thing is that you have to take a look at basing when you're working in tabletop, quality miniatures. You have to look at it not so much as like, well, now I have to completely paint this entire base and like work on that and do all that kind of stuff. You don't think of it as one miniature and one base, and both of them are going to take the same amount of time, and you're going to put the same amount of effort into it. When I work on my basing, I like my basing to be there. I like it to have a little bit of interest. But the thing that I don't want my basing to do, I don't want my basing to take away from the paint job that I spent so much time on the actual model. It is very easy to create and paint a base that can actually completely draw the eye away from the model on the tabletop. And generally you don't want that. So I kind of learned early on that my bases, in some situations, on bigger, fancier models, I will try to get a little bit kind of squirrely and add in a little bit more detail and that kind of stuff. But generally, I always work my bases so that they are just there to support and kind of slightly play off of the miniature, but they are really there to be second, if not third or fourth fiddle. The miniature itself is the important thing. And so because of that, as I've been evolving over the course of my painting, I've learned a bunch of things, which I want to share with you here. And one of the biggest things that I've learned to love is paint your bases gray, man. Now, let me explain kind of how that goes. When I first started getting into painting chaos, and then a little bit into my chaos stuff, and that was 40K chaos. And then when I started getting into painting chaos for Age of Sigmar, I really wanted the bases for my models to be, I wanted them to look like just an ashen field. Like for 40K, I was like, okay, this entire planet's made out of ash, which obviously that wouldn't work. But like the surface is just all ash, everything's burned down, and that's what I wanted it to look like. So I definitely worked in those sort of situations, and I made my models look like they were standing in kind of like fields of ash. And I did the same type of thing when I started getting into painting for Age of Sigmar, my Chaos army. I wanted to make sure that my entire Chaos army, I wanted to have the same base. Cannot stress this enough. If you're building up an entire army, try to make it so they're all bases match. And when you do, once you've figured out what you want your basing to look like, write it down. I've talked, I don't know how many times before, about writing down a journal, keeping track of your paint recipes, because if some new models get released a little bit later on. These guys came a good deal after the beginning of my Age of Sigmar. The Varangard came out probably a year after I started working on my Chaos Age of Sigmar army. I wanted to be able to make the bases look like the bases I had done in the other models. So luckily I went back to my notes and went, oh, okay, I use this color and then this and then that wash and then this dry brush. And that kind of stuff is important to keep track of. But make sure not only that your models all have the same bases within an army, but also to sit down and look at it from the aspect of, if this base is overpowering the model, then this time that I spent on the model is kind of a bit wasted. So as I've said, as I painted more and more models in the last, say, 4, 5, 6 years, I have been sticking with predominantly gray bases. And that's not just for my chaos. It's been for a lot of my different models. Sometimes it's a gray base with a little bit more of a warmer tone, which I can do with washes like Agrax Earthshade or stuff like that. Sometimes I'm going with a bit of a cooler tone. Sometimes the dry brushing is what kind of tweaks the color. But the fact that I'm sticking generally with grays means that all the color work that I put into the model can really allow it to pop and stand out from the base. If you have, let's say, a green model and you put it standing on grass, that's going to be kind of a conflict in the look of it. If you take a bright yellow model, Imperial Fists or something like that, and you stand them on bright yellow sand, again, it's going to look weird. But pretty much anything that you put on top of a gray color really makes the colors on that particular model pop. And gray is relatively simple to paint, and it also fits into a lot of situations. As I started getting into Kill Team, I wanted pretty much all of my different kill teams, forces, whatever, to be able to sort of mix and match. I was never going to run Death Guard with Death Watch, don't get me wrong. I just always wanted all of them to have the same type of base. And my idea generally when playing Kill Team is that you are playing in some sort of an urban-y kind of ruiny area. And the thing that we've learned over the last 100+ years of warfare in the modern age, such as it is that when lots and lots of buildings get blown up and knocked down, everything gets covered in a gray dust. Everything gets covered in just this gray, superfine, ashy powder sort of stuff all over the place. So I always wanted to make sure that all of my different Kill Team models all have the same type of base. And I think I did a video quite some time ago about how to do the very simple sort of urban base where you actually just use the texture that is part of the base, and then you just sprinkle a little bit of kitty litter on there and do some color, and then boom, there you go. Pachow. And so I wanted to make sure that all my different Kill Team models all had the same base. And in doing that, going through Kill Team after Kill Team with the same base, I started to notice that it just sort of emphasized, I figured, the way the models looked, because the colors and all that kind of stuff had something very neutral to play off of, and it worked very well. Now you may say, but Uncle Adam, I can't always use a super, just gray base. We're not always fighting in urban, areas, and that's true. Let's say you're playing with, again, something fantasy. A big, huge battle that starts out on a huge field, eventually that field is just mud. So you could do something kind of the same and try to make like a brownie texture and get real sort of muddy and grungy. Years ago, I painted some Dark Age robots from a faction called Core from the game Dark Age, from Cool Mini or Not. And the planet they were on was supposed to be kind of a darker, muddier sort of dry desert in areas, but also dark, muddy world. And so these models that I did for Core, I just basically went with a real dark, and there's a little bit of like glossiness here and there to make it look like there's an almost completely dry stream and that kind of stuff. But again, you don't have to always use gray, but I find that colors that are a bit darker, and kind of more muted and things like that really allow then the colors in the model to pop and make a lot more sense. Doing that kind of stuff, thinking about that ahead of time, even potentially practicing on, just a base, just to try it out and get the colors right and see if you like what you're going to do, especially if you're doing a bigger army. Planning that stuff ahead of time just makes a lot more sense. But we can't always be fighting in urban rubble and, hellscape mud worlds. Sometimes you need to be fighting in the desert, and that's a slightly different thing, and it makes sense in the right situation. For Star Wars Legion, I painted desert on my bases for my stormtroopers, my Imperials, and all that kind of stuff, because I wanted to have it be kind of like Tatooine, which made sense to me. Plus, because it was going to be Tatooine, and there were lots of cool Tatooine-style buildings that I could find, I also got a Tatooine-style mat, and since I knew that very frequently I was going to be hosting games of Star Wars Legion, I decided to just go full desert. Not only to paint the desert textures on the Stormtroopers, but I even painted my Snowtroopers to be desert, and my Scouts as well. So the Stormtroopers are still white, armor on top of desert, but these guys are tan, and they're on top of desert, and so are the Scouts. So taking that into consideration, looking at the planning ahead in that situation, and coming up with the concept, and then sticking to it is super important. But again, the The color in this situation with these guys who are desert colored on desert stuff, it makes sense. It's just, because they should be there. That's why you're doing it that way. But I still was able to make them stand out through a lot of contrast in the darker parts of those models so that they still stood out from the base pretty well. One of the last things I want to touch on basing is just to reiterate something that I said a long time ago in another video, but I think it bears repeating, and that is do your actual texturing first before you prime. I talked about it in another video, pachow. And it's super important because when you get to the point when you are done with your model, and now maybe you're showing it off on Facebook or wherever, and you're like, look, hey, check out this cool model I painted, and people just see that black plastic base. If you just want to stick with black plastic bases and stuff like that, that's a choice. You can do that. That's fine. But if you're like, oh no, I'm going to put the texture and all that kind of stuff on there later on down the road. But are you though? Because you've finished the model at this point, and now going back and putting glue on the base, potentially getting glue on the feet, all that kind of stuff. Like I said, I talked about it in the other video, but it's super important to understand that if you texture at the beginning, then when you get done painting the model, and maybe you got some of the leg and the shoe color onto the dirt, well, now you're going to paint the dirt and you're going to take care of it. And having that texture already there, at least once you get finished with the model, is like, you're great. I'm basically at least just about done because I don't have to go down through and texture all these guys and potentially goof up my paint job. So think about your basing, but also understand to not go crazy with your basing in tabletop games. Again, like I said at the beginning, if you're trying to paint something for display that you're going to put on a shelf or enter into a competition, then you kind of want to go crazy with basing. It's super important and judges look at that stuff. But when you are trying to show off the models and not show off the bases, it's important to look at the bases from the aspect of like, how do I use these to support the look of my models and not draw away from it?